最近台湾品牌永续蓝图学校举办第1期的品牌永续长认证班培训，有幸担任结业评审，刚好可以跟你分享一些心得。在台湾乃至于全球，导入 ESG 永续概念的企业、顾问公司非常多，但是只有很少人及很少企业把 ESG 跟品牌结合，来形成强大的品牌力，获得 Z 世代年轻人的欢迎。根据金管会揭露时程，2023年资本额100亿元以上的上市柜公司，以及钢铁、水泥业等，已列入强制碳盘查对象。同年，资本额20亿元以上的上市柜公司，也要开始编制永续报告书。全球对 ESG 永续的要求以及推动，已经如火如荼展开，但是台湾在 ESG 永续的理解，还得加快脚步。毕竟理解、执行，有成果才能赋能品牌。我记得在评审当天问了学员一个问题：未来公司在 ESG 永续的投入，希望在 Scope 1、2或3的哪一个领域开始？可能太紧张吧，学员没有回答得很好，但是我觉得这是对这个议题最基本的理解，不能不清楚，这是制作这个影片的目的。ESG 中有关 E， 也就是 Environmental 环境永续、温室气体盘查的定义，主要是根据 ISO 14064 2006版、ISO 14064 2018版以及 GHG Protocol 的分类。ISO 14064 2006版把温室气体排放分成 Scope 1、Scope 2、Scope 3，也就是范畴1、范畴2、范畴3。12年后，新版 ISO 14064 2018版把范畴3再细分成类别3到类别6，而在 GHG Protocol 分类中，进一步把范畴3分成15个类别。事实上，范畴3的碳排放比起范畴1加范畴2加起来还要多，也是最难盘查。目前上市柜公司中提供范畴3盘查报告的也是少之又少。无论是新版 ISO 或 GHG Protocol， 都是以范畴1到3来分类。那么，什么是 Scope 1、Scope 2、Scope 3呢？下面这段影片是 Microsoft 承诺2030年要达到负碳排 （Carbon Negative），2050年要做到净零 （Net Zero） 所发布的影片。影片中对于 Scope 1、2、3 Net Zero 有浅显易懂的解释，对于人类减碳爱地球也有深深的期许。我把这段影片翻译成中文，用生成式 AI 上字幕，跟你分享。
The scientific consensus is clear. The world has a huge carbon problem. Humans have released more than 2 trillion metric tons of greenhouse gases into the Earth's atmosphere since the start of the first industrial revolution. And the vast majority of these emissions have occurred since the mid-1950s. This is more carbon than nature can reabsorb. And every year, humanity pumps out more than 50 billion additional tons of greenhouse gases. This blanket of carbon in our atmosphere is heating the planet and changing our climate. And this isn't a problem that lasts just a few years or even a decade. Once excess carbon enters the atmosphere, it can take thousands of years to dissipate. Already, the planet's temperature has risen by 1 degree Celsius. And if we don't curb emissions and temperatures continue to climb, science tells us that the results will be catastrophic. In fact, scientists agree that if we don't do anything, temperatures could rise somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius. So what can we do? Well, it starts by understanding and getting real about carbon math. Scientists account for carbon emissions by classifying them into 3 categories or scopes. Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions that your activities create, like the exhaust from the car you drive. Or, for a business, the trucks it drives to transport its products from one place to another, or the diesel generators it might run. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions that come from the production of the electricity or heat you use, like the traditional energy sources that light up your home, or power the buildings owned by a business. Scope 3 emissions are the indirect emissions that come from all the other activities in which you're engaged, including the emissions associated with producing the food you eat or manufacturing the products that you buy. For a business, these emission sources can be extensive and must be accounted for across its entire supply chain, from the materials in its buildings, the business travel of its employees, to the full life cycle of its products, including the electricity that customers may consume when using something like a phone, laptop, or gaming console. Given this broad range, a company's Scope 3 emissions are often far larger than its Scope 1 and 2 emissions put together. And this accounting is important because if we're going to avoid the worst aspects of a rapidly changing climate, then the world must reduce its carbon emissions and reach net zero across all scopes. Now, net zero doesn't mean that there will no longer be any carbon emissions at all, but it does mean that the world will need to remove as much carbon as it emits. This will require two things. First, we'll need to reduce carbon emissions very substantially over the next few decades. And second, we'll need to remove carbon from the atmosphere, starting with nature-based removal approaches, but ultimately through including new carbon removal technologies, like direct air capture approaches that literally remove carbon from the air. And while the world will need to reach net zero, those of us who can afford to move faster and go further should do so. That's why Microsoft is committing to become carbon negative by 2030, meaning that we'll reduce our emissions by half and remove from the atmosphere more carbon than we emit, including all of our Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. It's why we're also committing to remove, by 2050, all of the carbon Microsoft has emitted, either directly or by electrical consumption, since it was founded in 1975. Simply put, the stakes are too high for us to not make bold changes now. The world is counting on all of us to act.
看完影片，相信你对 ESG 有更多的认识。如果你要经营一个消费者认同的 ESG 品牌，请看我的书《ESG 品牌创新6部曲》。这本书不是教你如何节能减碳，而是建议你如何为品牌选择 ESG 的议题，如何定位 ESG 品牌，如何设定品牌行动，以及如何思考品牌的成长策略。全书分6大步，完全是以建立 ESG 品牌的角度出发。我想邀请你加入下端连结的高端讯读者交流社群，有几千人每天都在这里学习有关大数据、数位转型、最新 AI 应用以及 ESG 品牌赋能新知。高端讯认为这些努力都是为了经营一个大数据数位转型时代的杰出品牌。喜欢我的内容，再按赞、订阅和分享。